Well, let's go live now to Quebec City and catch up with our reporter, our correspondent, BRYCE-PEASE. Comme toujours, enchanté. Always a pleasure to have you, Sherwin. And it's counting down now. I believe our head of state has arrived in Canada, if not in Quebec.
I have just tweeted a picture, Peter, of President Ramaphosa with his feet firmly on the tarmac in Toronto. As we mentioned in that piece, his first engagement, the first stop on his two-city stop here in Canada is Toronto, where he's engaging with business and investment leaders as part of that 5-year, $100 billion drive, part of this new dawn that the president certainly is pushing. And then he will travel here to Quebec City and then on to the summit event in Charlevoix, where I tell you it's going to be some tense discussions and a tense dinner that he's going to attend with the leaders of the world, of the G7 and some of the invited leaders tonight. President Trump, I can also tell you, is en route here, expected to arrive within the hour, making some very objectionable remarks about European allies, particularly as it relates to trade. And certainly a standoff that we're expecting between the G7 leaders, some of them now referring to the G6+1 in terms of the isolation that the United States president can expect when he arrives here.
Well, some of the things that President Trump has been talking about involves Russia, and this is a country that is very much involved in his own politics, his election, and yet he was suggesting that they should be sat at the table.
Absolutely right, Peter. Just as he was boarding Marine One, the helicopter that takes him to Andrews Base, where he boards Air Force One, he made some comments to reporters calling for Russia to be readmitted to the G7. Remember, this was the G8. Russia was then excluded from the G8 due to their annexation and breaking international law, their illegal annexation of Crimea in Ukraine. Of course, nothing has changed on that front, so questions being raised as to why President Trump would make this call. It seemed to be shooting from the hip. I'm not sure that this has been a long-standing discussion, but it becomes now suddenly an agenda item that certainly the media, the press, analysts are very curious about. Why would the president make these remarks, given the already fractured relations we are seeing, particularly on the economic question, with their Atlantic, their European allies? You know, one analyst is saying that he is shredding the Atlantic alliance to get closer to Russia, to get closer to North Korea and China, and this really is rubbing people up the wrong way. And we saw elements of this yesterday in a tweet war between French President Emmanuel Macron and President Trump. Just to refer to some of those exchanges, Peter, Emmanuel Macron tweeting yesterday that the American president may not mind being isolated, but neither do we mind signing a 6-country agreement if need be, because these 6 countries represent values and economic market which has the weight of history behind it and which is now a true international force. President Trump then responding, Peter, please tell Prime Minister Trudeau and President Macron that they are charging the U.S. massive tariffs and creating non-monetary barriers. The EU trade surplus with the United States is $151 billion. And Canada keeps our farmers on. He also went on in a further tweet to refer to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, his host at the summit, as being indignant. And this is not the type of language one expects friends. You know, if you remember just a couple of weeks ago, the cozy relationship we certainly saw on display for the cameras between Emmanuel Macron and President Trump. I mean, they even kissed each other on the cheek. I mean, this is an unprecedented move for President Donald Trump. So very unclear how this relationship, how the showdown might play itself out, but this is certainly not going to be an easy conversation behind closed doors among the G7 leaders later today.
All right, so that's all behind closed doors, but outside, and we saw a little bit in your report just before you came on air, there'll be probably some protests playing out as well.
Well, there's a huge police contingent. You know, Peter, I've seen a number that the cost of this G7 summit is around $600 million, and 70% of that has been spent on security, securing the venue. We're at a media center. There is an area for protests. There's also an area where the actual summit is going to take place in Charlevoix, which is hugely fortified. And the concern here is that G7, historically, G7 G7 protests tend to be violent. If you look at the scenes in Italy last year, tear gas, riot police confronting some of the protesters. I've been speaking to my Canadian colleagues who work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They asked me if I had armored gear to put on and a helmet before I ventured out there, because law enforcement and journalists tend to be targets from these some of the disruptors in these protests. We sent pictures and tweeted pictures earlier of shop windows that have been boarded up. Such is the concern here. Multiple shop windows, I might add. Such is the concern here that things could get violent, and the police certainly will be at the ready to confront any violence that might emanate from some of these protests today and over the next few days.
Sherwin, we're going to leave it there for the time being, and I'm sure we'll catch up with you again a little bit later on. That's our correspondent, Sherwin BRYCE-PEASE, who's normally speaking to us from New York, but is in Quebec ahead of that G7 gathering and talking about New York. As we speak right now, the UN is busy deciding whether South Africa should get a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and we'll bring you an update on that as soon as that vote is concluded. But it's looking as if